Hello, my most amazing artists. Today we're going back to your chalk pastel drawings of the Aurora Borealis, or inspired by the Northern Lights or Southern Lights. I already opened my paper up that was folded in my table folder, and now I can go back to fixing up some of my lights in case they smeared a little bit. So to remember or remind ourselves, in case you didn't finish or weren't here, we ripped a white piece of paper to get a random pattern and then colored on that white piece of paper at the tippy top of it with chalk pastels. Then you use your finger to swipe up to transfer the chalk pastel onto the black paper and get the effect of the dancing lights in the sky. Then you tear off that used part of the paper to do new colors and a new pattern of lights underneath it, but still leaving some space in the sky. This time, since I'm at my horizon line, I'm using it to make the bumpy mountains. Mountains are not just triangles, they are random and they are bumpy. So I'm putting a bumpy line of snowy mountains in the background on top of my horizon line, or connected to the horizon line. It didn't work out perfectly with the paper, so I added some of my own on there. Then I held the chalk pastel on its side to get that snowy texture and to work quicker and cover more area faster. Then I flip it upside down after. You're going to see that I'm going to create the reflection. But first I wanted to add a little bit of blue to make it look like it was an icy lake and that it's cold out. But underneath that horizon line where the lake starts, or the water, I'm going to flip my white piece of paper upside down, the one that I used for the mountains. That way I can show a little bit of that horizon line and the mountains reflecting into the water. You would see it just a little bit and there would be a gap in between the two. So I show some of that black space or water in between, and then after the gap, I put my mountains upside down and make them a little smudgy and smeared because it would be distorted with the reflection in the water. It wouldn't be perfect, but it is upside down, the exact reflection. If I got a little bit too much smudging in there, then I can go back with my black chalk pastel and kind of bring some of that black dark paper back. And then I can even use it to add some details to my mountains. Maybe if they don't quite look like mountains, I can make some lines in between them, make some texture on them to show that they're rocky or bumpy, whatever it is. I can add some black chalk pastel very, very lightly though. I'm not going too crazy with it. Now, if I didn't finish my reflection in the water, I'm going to go ahead back to my scrap papers that I used and swipe any remaining chalk pastel on them down this time, because I flip them upside down and swipe down for the reflection in the water. If I already threw them out last class, but you still want to make more reflections, you can just do it and do similar colors that you did on the top and kind of follow what it would look like if they were reflecting in the water. But again, the water is moving usually, so it's a little bit distorted. It doesn't have to be perfect, and you don't have to do it super bright. When it's reflecting in the water, yes, it's bright, but not super, super bright as they are in the sky. So it makes sense to have it a little less. Now we're going to get to use black paint and a tiny paintbrush to add some tiny details, like little trees in there. So I'm going to be making a tree using a just straight line. Now it has to be on my horizon line somewhere in the snow. Wouldn't make sense to make my tree in the water. So I'm going to go ahead and make a straight line and then use the back side of my paintbrush to swipe down to the left and down to the right in a diagonal motion. It's not just making a triangle, I'm just painting a stick or a line with my paintbrush side, then turning it over, and before the paint dries, really quickly scratching or swiping to the left down and to the right down. That's going to make it look like a way more realistic tree, but I'm also able to make it look that way super, super fast. If you notice that your hand is smudging your chalk pastel while you're painting, you can put a piece of scrap paper underneath it or even a paper towel. That way you can rest your hand on it without smearing or smudging all of your hard work. You do want to be extra careful not to smudge what's already on there. I will be spraying these with a finishing spray to make it stay, but for now, we got to make sure that you just do your best job to keep that chalk where it is as you're painting. We'll spray these when they're all done and they're on the drying rack later today. So I'm going to be making all these trees different spots of my horizon line. The ones that are closest to the water are going to be the ones that are the biggest because they are closer in distance. The ones that are farther back near the mountains, or maybe even on the mountains, are going to be really small because that's showing that they're really far away. So that's called the foreground when they're up close to you and bigger, the middle ground when they're medium size and kind of nearing the horizon line, and then the background is where it's behind the horizon line or right on the horizon line, really far away, close to the background where you have your sky. This one I'm going to paint the biggest right on that foreground or right on that little space before the lake. So I'm painting trees of all different sizes, practicing my technique of just using a little bit of paint and swiping down to the left and down to the right in that motion to create a realistic looking tree. Now I'm going to swipe left and right across my paper in big swipes and swooshes to kind of make it look like water, because it would not have all perfect reflection in there. It would have some waves or little bits of darker spots of that water where it's a little bit distorted. So I'm just swiping with my paintbrush back and forth on the paintbrush side to make it look more like water. If I was thinking at the time when I did this, I could have also made the reflection of the trees. That would have been smart, Mrs. Q. So you should probably make some reflections of your trees too. They don't have to be perfectly swiped down or with all those details, but you would have them upside down if you want to do any kind of tree reflections in there. You don't have to though. Now I'm going to go ahead and add some stars to my sky. To do that, I have to wipe off my paintbrush using an art wipe or a paper towel and wipe off both the brush side and the end of it. The end of it's the most important part, but the brush side you should also wipe off too, just in case you get black paint on your hands. That's what you can use an art wipe for. We won't be making trips to the sink today back and forth because we're just going to get messy again. We're using lots of messy art supplies, and art is all about making messes, but then we clean them up. It's a beautiful mess. So I'm using the end of my paintbrush with a tiny bit of white paint and making tiny little dots that are going to represent stars. It might also look like snow if I make them bigger. I'm going to try my best to make them as small as possible to look a little more like stars. If you know anything about constellations, you could try to put them in different groups of stars to represent constellations in the sky if you wanted to. Especially at the northern lights, you would be able to see at the North Pole and South Pole the stars really well and all of those constellations. So if you happen to know some formations there, you can make them. If not, you can make them up yourself or just dot randomly all over. It's okay to keep your paintbrush without paint on it. All you got to do is tap, and those are going to get smaller, realistic looking stars. If you add a ton of paint, it's going to look like giant globs of snow or maybe even hail. And I don't know if we necessarily want it to be hailing all over your awesome northern lights. So make sure you're just using a little tiny bit of white paint there and try not to get it on your hands or on the table. Then when we're all done, we're going to wipe off that paintbrush, put the lids on the paints, and put your awesome Aurora Borealis or Aurora Australis on the drying rack. Have fun today, artists! Don't forget that you can always scratch your name into the paint or sign your name with paint or chalk pastel at the bottom. Have fun!